that. Let's return now to security and foreign affairs issues. Joining me is the Shadow Home Affairs and Cyber Security Minister, James Patterson. Let's start with the condemnation of the Iranian ambassador. Dennis Richardson was on the program earlier, calling him a ratbag for the tweet and message that he put out, the anti-Semitic tweet. The government's been critical of this message from the Iranian ambassador, but you're saying they're not going far enough. What do you want to see?
Well, this is incredibly extreme, inflammatory and irresponsible rhetoric from a foreign ambassador. Frankly, if an Australian citizen was engaged in that kind of rhetoric, they'd be running a very serious risk that they were guilty of incitement to violence or racial vilification, and they'd be charged with that. But of course, foreign diplomats are immune from Australian law under the Vienna Convention. And so if the government is really concerned about what the ambassador has said, then there are powers available to the Minister for Foreign Affairs to make an ambassador persona non grata and send them home. And it's up to the government and the Foreign Minister to explain if she's not going to use those powers, if she's not going to do so, why isn't she? And how bad would it have to get? What could they say that would cause her to use that option available to her?
Would a coalition government kick this person out?
Look, it's premature for me to say that now from opposition. Only the government is aware of all of the facts of our bilateral relationship with Iran, but it is incumbent on the government to explain this, to say what they are going to do about it. It's all well and good for Penny Wong to be outraged, but what's she actually going to do about it? What are the consequences for the Iranian ambassador and his embassy in Australia from this conduct?
The government, on another front, on the UNRWA funding, the opposition leader says they've got some explaining to do. If this is all proven to be factual, that 9 UNRWA staffers were involved in that October 7 attack, the government says their approach has been appropriate, pausing funding until the investigation was complete. Is that a fair justification of the way they've managed it from an Australian perspective?
No, it's not, because it's not accurate. The federal government announced the resumption of the funding for UNRWA prior to the conclusion of this investigation. Australian taxpayers' funds are again flowing to UNRWA, and we now know, in UNRWA's own estimation, that they employed 9 terrorists who participated in the worst atrocity against the Jewish people since the end of the Holocaust on the 7th of October. These are Hamas terrorists who worked for UNRWA, and Australian taxpayers' money goes to that organisation. I mean, it is a particular insult to Australians who are struggling with a cost of living crisis that the increased taxes that they've been paying on this government's watch have in part been going to fund terrorists in the Middle East. And we warned the government. There is no excuse. We called on them to stop funding. They paused it and then resumed it. And so they are completely culpable for any funds that have gone to an organisation that employs terrorists.
Completely culpable. That they've said that they paused it, and that now, given this critical role that UNRWA plays in terms of providing humanitarian support, it was resumed. Do you believe that they should cease the funding once again?
No Australian taxpayer would tolerate the risk that their hard-earned money could be going to terrorists or terrorist organisations. And unless the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister can guarantee the Australian people that no Australian taxpayer dollar will be going to terrorists in the future, then they should stop funding to UNRWA, and they should seek aid partners in the region who can provide that guarantee. It is not a risk any taxpayer should be willing to bear. And by the way, if an Australian citizen sent money to a terrorist organisation in the Middle East, they'd be breaking the law. They could be prosecuted. They could be sent to jail under our terrorism financing laws. And so we should be no more comfortable with the risk that our taxpayers' money would be falling into the same hands.
We've seen the elevated terror threat level. The message here is that this is a broad range of concerns, that people are being radicalised quicker online. Is the job of ASIO harder today than what it was in years gone by?
Yes, there's no question at all that Mike Burgess and his team at ASIO have a tougher task than any previous Director General or team at ASIO, because it's a much more complex threat environment. There are people responding to a range of contradictory and extreme ideologies. There are young people who are being radicalised more quickly online by accessing extreme content from all around the world. And some of these people can go from no intention to commit violence to intention to commit violence in a matter of days and weeks. A much more rapid radicalisation pathway than we've seen in previous iterations, even at the height of the Islamic State era. So it's a very complex environment, and I was concerned to hear the Director General say in an interview last night that ASIO is stretched. Our key domestic security intelligence organisation should not be stretched. They should have all the resources they need to protect Australians from terrorism, from foreign interference, from espionage and all the other important work they
do. The appropriate checks are being made, apparently, according to Tim Ayres and Tony Burke. I spoke to Tim Ayres this morning. He's reiterating Tony Burke's message about those that have been granted visas out of Gaza. I want to put to you, though, Tim Ayres had a crack at you today, saying that you've been playing politics and jumping all over this issue, he says, and he said pretty quick out of the box and making things up. He says all appropriate checks are being made on those that have been granted visas. Are you reassured by Tim Ayres and Tony Burke's comments in relation to those leaving Gaza?
But Kieran, I'll have to take some time to recover from that devastating attack from Tim Ayres. I don't share his confidence that the adequate checks were done because Home Affairs officials admitted to me in Senate estimates that of the more than 2,500 visas granted to Palestinian document holders, including people coming out of Gaza, that on average these temporary visitor visas were granted in 24 hours and in some instances as quickly as 1 hour. It's up to the government to explain how you can do an adequate identity check, let alone a full security check, on someone leaving a war zone controlled by a terrorist organisation in such quick time. But there's good evidence to suggest that the adequate checks were not done because they subsequently ended up cancelling some of those visas that they initially granted. So clearly, more work was being done, security issues were identified and visas were cancelled. I think there's been an unseemly rush on this issue and I'm concerned that Australians are being exposed to danger as a result.
Yeah, and does that extend to the possibility of a permanent residency granted to that cohort as well? Is that part of your concern here, or do you believe that once visas are granted, that appropriate security checks are being done onshore?
I am concerned by that because when speaking to your colleague Andrew Clennell on Sunday, the Home Affairs Minister implied that further and more extensive security checks would now have to take place if more permanent visas were granted. Well, if all the security checks that were necessary were done in the first place, why are additional security checks required? Why were these people given temporary visitor visas in the first place, given that the Minister has said there's no possibility of any of them returning to Gaza? There was never any possibility that anyone who left Gaza would want to return to Gaza. But the terms of a temporary visitor visa are that you intend to return to where you reside and you're only here on a temporary basis. So if the government's plan was always to bring these people out and to rehome them permanently, then why did they grant them these visas? Why did they not have adequate security checks? Why are they now having to do more security checks?
James Patterson, appreciate your time as always.
Thanks, Kieran.